Hello, good morning. It is Friday, the 19th. Yes. And this is a special week. Sunday is Father's Day. So I hope you honor your father. And if you're a dad, be honored. You have a tough job. Keep doing it well as a servant, and you will be rewarded both in things that you observe over the years with your kids. I promise. Keep serving. You'll see the fruit. It might take a while. But also you'll be rewarded by your Heavenly Father who knows that our kids need a stable, secure, empowered, serving father. So keep up the good work. Keep fighting the good fight of fatherhood, fathers. Today is a section in chapter 14, verses 1 through 11. And I think I just need to pause and refer back to yesterday's teaching. I just feel like it was way too broad. I didn't know how else to handle it other than to read the entirety and recognize that Jesus is talking about near term and far term to do with God's keeping his promise to wrap up this portion of redemptive history so that he can usher in the vivid reality, the lasting portion of redemptive renewal. And so, as a teacher, I want to communicate with clarity and with certainty and confidence things that I'm clear and confident about so that you can gain that same level of clarity and confidence. My recommendation as to chapter 13 of Mark, which has parallels in the other Gospels, is to study it for yourself. So there you go. How do you like that for a punt? I just punted that. Ooh, it's a 45-yarder, 4.5-second hang time. So let's get right into this text. Beautiful text. And I've titled this section, verses 1 through 11 of Mark 14, In Memory of, because there are two individuals in this section, each of whom we not only have memory of, but we have details on, and for two very different reasons. And I always like to find myself in the most positive, heroic example of any character in a story. Isn't that our tendency? But when I look at this what I call gospel story sandwich, and it's a sandwich because the bread, the beginning of the section and the end of the section are what I call the bread containers, the top and the bottom. And then in the middle, the meaty portion is just so beautiful. And that's how Jesus describes it. But when I look at this gospel sandwich, I have to be faced with, I must confront the possibility that both of these characters who we remember and we have details on in the story, uh, the possibility of each of them lives in me because I'm made of the same stuff they are. And it's truly a matter of my own devotional choices and my discipline and my desire to be more like that will determine whether or not I'm more like the character on the bread borders or more like the beautiful, meaty character in the middle. Mark does such a great job in this section. And when I say that, it's because he has arranged this material. This is nothing that he's made up. It's all historical. It's all part of the evidentiary recorded reality of Jesus's ministry, especially as we move towards, which is just in a very few short hours, Jesus's arrest and crucifixion. But he's arranged the evidentiary material in such a way that we can highlight these two distinct characters, the bread border of Judas, and this beautiful middle story that is Mary, sister of Lazarus. And you don't see that in the text, but John lets us know, John's gospel. And so as I look at this arrangement by Mark, a beautiful arrangement, just so well done, I must be willing to be confronted with myself and look in the mirror, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, allow God to crack open my chest yet again. You know, life of discipleship is always saying yes to having your chest cracked open and having the bright, beautiful, refining, purifying light of God's Spirit poking around in there, if you will. And it always pays dividends. It's not always comfortable. As a matter of fact, it's rarely comfortable. Sometimes painful, as I see myself, honestly, but always pays dividends as I allow God's Spirit to continue to conform me, to shape me, to build me into the image of my Savior. So let's get right into it. Uh, this is Wednesday, Thursday. So some of this calendar depends on the Jewish calendar and our harmonization with our calendar. It's not a lot of difference, but we're probably here talking about early Thursday. Uh, and Friday, as you know, will be the day when Jesus is crucified. And so we are getting close. And so Jesus is in Jerusalem, and so these first two verses are the bread portion, uh, and we'll see embedded in this top piece of bread. We'll see, or maybe it's the bottom piece of bread because gravity insists that the bread begins on the bottom and then the sandwich is built. So in this first bread border, we'll see embedded Jesus's betrayal by Judas, and the catalyst for the betrayal we'll find through the meaty part of the story with Mary. Uh, but the foundation of the story is the religious leaders in their hatred and insecurity and being highly threatened of Jesus's popularity, by his popularity, by his authority, by his his claim in his identity to be the Son of God, their insistence on ridding him from the scene. But as you see, they plainly did not want to rile up the people. They still have an overwrought fear of people, which is always a problem for a follower of Christ. To be more uh, connected to the approval of culture than to the approval of Jesus is always a danger. In kind of the same way, these religious leaders who should have been more interested in an honest, authentic fear of God guiding their behavior than any people's affirmation, we see just the reverse as they plan or they continue to scheme to arrest Jesus and put him to death. It seems that they were not really that interested in having this done on the Passover. God, however, in his mission for Jesus, is interested. And I might unpack that a little more today, but I will certainly next week if I don't today. Verse 1. So, first two verses are the foundational bread border of the sandwich. Now, the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. So they were looking for a one-off opportunity that didn't have anything to do with the throngs of people who were enjoying this festival of Passover. They didn't want it to be public. And as a matter of fact, if you read the Gospels together, the four stories together, you'll see that they were okay with just waiting till all the excitement died down, which would have put the arrest, the holding, and then the crucifixion, or however he was going to be put to death, even beyond briefly the Passover celebration. But we'll see that they receive a nice surprise. So one of my favorite commentators is William Barclay, which is interesting because Barclay probably wasn't someone who was dedicated to Orthodox Christianity, but a great historian that was genuine. Because if he didn't, it doesn't matter how good his scholarship and knowledge of history is in and around the biblical story and the history of Israel prior to Jesus coming on the scene. It doesn't matter how much we know; it matters who we know. But anyway, this is what Barclay reminded me of as I was rereading the whole Passover explosion every year. Uh, Barclay says it was compulsory for every adult male Jew who lived within 15 miles of Jerusalem to come to the Passover. Now, you may not think that's a long way, but when you're talking about mountainous country and no cars, uh, mostly walking, you'll see that's a long way. But that didn't stop people from coming from all around. Uh, Barclay says, in actuality, far more than just these within that proximity came. It was the one ambition of every Jew to eat at least one Passover in Jerusalem before he died. So if you know Passover, you know the highlight of the festival is the Hebrews being delivered out of bondage to Egypt, and all the elements of that story are in symbol in the Passover meal. And so Barclay reminds us of how important the Passover is and how many people are in town. And one thing Barclay did, I hope you enjoy this. I'm kind of geeking out here a bit. One thing Barclay did in his research was he found a census of how many lambs were sold as sacrifice in a particular Passover that was around Jesus's public ministry time. So these are families to be represented by one lamb that's sacrificed. So a family had to bring a lamb. The sacrifice was to cover their sin, and then they were free or clean, at least externally, Hebrews chapter 9 and 10, to enjoy the Passover. And so they would sell these, as we saw earlier, they would sell these in and around the temple. And so one particular census of the number of lambs sold was like 265,000 lambs sold. So if you project, it wasn't uncommon for a family of Jews, the nuclear and then slightly extended family, to have 10 people. So if you have like an average 10 or 11 people, you're talking about almost as many as 3 million people in Jerusalem at this time for the Passover. So this is just a swell and a packed in, like it's like a sardine can full of people. And, and so this is of these people who were now more and more amazed at Jesus and his teaching and the way he answered the religious leaders well and really put them in their place, put them where they belong, and that's subjugated to Jesus's authority. So this is the foundational bread. They were looking for a way to secretly arrest him and hold him in private until a time where there was no attention that could be pointed at them directly by the people as the Passover was brimming. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. So that is the bread, and embedded in this foundation is Judas's betrayal. If you remember Mark chapter 3, way back when Judas was chosen as one of the 12, he was actually the last one listed, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus. So we're right there at this time, and so this is the ugly foundation of this sandwich, this gospel sandwich, this story that must play out. And so that's how Mark arranges the beginning of this section. And so now there's a pause. And now we go to this beautiful anti-example of this in this magnificent, extravagant expression of love and devotion and sacrifice for Jesus. Verse 3, while Jesus was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, and I just kind of said, okay, where else would he be? So Simon the leper could actually be Lazarus himself. And if you know the story of Lazarus in particular in John chapter 11, you'll recognize the possibility there. While he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman who John identifies, John the gospel writer in his own gospel identifies as Mary, Lazarus's sister and Martha's sister. A woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard, But what you should know is that it was customary that when a guest, and especially a distinguished guest, came into the home, it was expected that that person's feet would be washed and that that person's head would be anointed. Typically, it was just a few drops of this oil or perfume that was often very expensive, as it said right here. She came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. So the custom is just a few drops on the head. And this is the antitype of hatred and resistance and a dedication to expel Jesus. Expression of extravagant devotion and sacrifice. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Now, this would have been astounding. So, in the house are Jesus and his disciples, and probably Lazarus, Martha, and now Mary, and maybe some others. And they were reclining. You don't sit at a table in this culture. You recline. You usually rest on your left elbow and eat with your right hand. I know all this might be too weird or too much, but I think it's kind of cool because it helps me get context and understand what's going on. But this would have been shocking. But what they would have expected was Mary to come and just, you know, or be very careful to pour, but she just broke the jar, which is a symbol of this is to be spent solely for this person. Often, if you came to the end of a jar and you used the last few drops, you would break the container in a symbolic gesture that said, "No one else will be honored by this vessel." This isn't this beautiful? It's just beautiful, and that's how Jesus responds to it in a minute. Verse 4, some of those present were saying indignantly to one another. And literally, the text says it could mean both and. It could mean they were whispering to each other and also in themselves going, "What? Why the waste of this perfume?" Now, just pause there. Think about who's in the house. Jesus' followers, his disciples who have walked and who still are calculating what this perfume is worth against the honoring of Jesus. Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor, which I think is a ruse, meaning it's just a justification, a rationalization for their shock and their possible greed rising up. Like, hey, we can sell this, give it to us, we'll take that. Judas was the keeper of the purse. That means he was the treasurer of the posse. And we don't see here exactly who's saying. Now, the other gospel stories have some expansion and some additional details. It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor. So this is like, we're calculating the usefulness of what you've done, and you have wasted this. And they rebuked her harshly. Verse 6, Jesus' response: leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful, that's kalos. It means good, lovely. It just has a depth of beauty to it. She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. And this is where it gets interesting because Jesus has mission clarity here, not so much burial customs, and you'll see it in the preparation of Jesus's body after the crucifixion, that the body was anointed with these same kinds of oils and perfumes. She poured perfume on my body, I'm in verse 8, beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever, this is the first in memory of, Wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Now, I've always wondered, what is Mary's response? We see Judas's response to, to his rebuke, or their rebuke, being rebuked by Jesus. But I wonder what Mary's response would have been to Jesus's commendation. And even beyond that, this is just now coming to her from Jesus himself that what she has done is actually part of the program of Jesus's mission and his clarity in fulfilling it. She's actually playing a part, not just to show her extravagant love and gratitude and sacrifice for who Jesus is and what he's done. Because if you know John 11 and you know the story of Lazarus' brother, you see that's just part of the depth of her devotion. But now she's being told, as she's being commended, and she now has a place in the memory, and we're talking about her today. It's June the 19th, 2020, and we're talking about this event that happened somewhere around AD 33 and some change. And Jesus says that she will be remembered in this little backwater home, in this really nothing. Jerusalem is something to the Jews, but it's, and she's being told that she has a place in the memory of this great gospel story, this great good news. I wonder how she would have responded, and just, you know, kind of like the other Mary, Jesus's mother. She treasured these things in her heart when she was finally recognizing who Jesus, her infant, was. This Mary, sister of Lazarus, is probably having this treasure up moment in her own heart as well. So now we've seen the foundational sandwich of the religious leaders looking for an opportunity. We've seen this beautiful story. The anti-type of hatred is extravagant devotion and love. And now we see the top. We see that what the religious leaders desired fell into their lap, because Judas, I believe, definitely in response to this kind of rebuke, he thought he was being used for the resources, and Jesus said, there is no better use of these resources. Mary has made a beautiful use of her resources, and she will be held in memorial wherever this gospel is preached, wherever this story is told, wherever this narrative is declared. And so we see Judas's response, and this in verse 10, this is a connecting, just a plain and, which means it's a continuing part of the action. This Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray Jesus to them. So this opportunity they're looking for, now they haven't. The chief priest and the religious leaders have an insider who can plan to have this thing offline, and as we know, it'll be in the Garden of Gethsemane, away from the action. So this opportunity they're hoping for falls into their lap as this disgruntled follower of Jesus comes to them. I'm back in verse 10. I'm just reading it again. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priest to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this, and the Greek word is literally like they were slapping five, like they were fist bumping, like they were doing the worm. I mean, figuratively, couldn't do it in their robes, of course. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So now again, we see Jesus's worthiness compared to the value of money. Dedication, extravagance, devotion to Jesus over and against the promise of some financial resource. And Judas is making this decision. And I've often wondered, is Judas's response because this is the last straw and he's fed up with being rebuked or diminished or his contribution not valued? Or is this Judas now forcing Jesus's hand? Jesus has made all these statements and he's not making good Jesus' kingdom. to see God's rule and reign now invade, but Judas isn't seeing enough action. So this is his desire to force Jesus's hand, as if, hey, if he's arrested and he's going to his death, he'll certainly have to bust out and call 10 legions of angels, and you know what I'm talking about, I think, so that he can be rescued and this kingdom can be ushered in, so we can all be satisfied and given our proper place. And I don't know what motivation is, except for at least greed and probably jealousy and maybe ambition on Judas's part, weighed over and against a pure, extravagant, careless, in a good way, devotion to Jesus. So I've kind of summarized this. The meaty, beautiful part of the sandwich reminds me of Jesus's parables in Matthew 13, when he talks about the value of the Jesus is the representative of the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all he had. This reminds me of the alabaster jar, broken, poured out. Went and sold all that he had and bought that field so that he could have the treasure. Verse 45, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for pearls. When he found one of great value and sold everything he had, jar broken and poured out, and he bought it. There's so much in here in this sandwich that reminds me of Judas, and probably not enough that reminds me of Mary, in all honesty. So some questions that come to mind as I review this text and open myself up to the Holy Spirit's examination. Here we go. You know, what or who are you willing to give your life up for? What are you spending your life on? Is it the stuff of the world or the status of the world? Position, affirmation of people? What are you spending your life on? What are you willing to extravagantly sacrifice everything for in order to gain? Mary makes it clear that there's only one gain for her, and that is Jesus. And she gives up everything she has in that act of affirmation that this is all I have and you're all I want. Is your love for Jesus calculated alongside your devotion to other worthy objects in this life? Meaning when it's time to to spend yourself in devotion of Jesus, do you begin to calculate and count the cost of the loss of other opportunities, or devotion to other things? These are important questions. Is your service to the kingdom calculated alongside the use of your resource for other worthy pursuits? When I read, when I eat this gospel sandwich from Mark 14, 1 through 11, I find way too much of Judas in me and not nearly enough of Mary. Oh Lord, may it be so that my devotion looks more and more like broken and poured out. So imagine this. People are going to be remembering you. So memory of Judas. So imagine this, in memory of you, what are you being remembered for? A life that looks like a calculated assessment of whether or not Jesus is worthy, or an absolutely being broken and poured out on behalf of and in devotion to the one who was broken and poured out for you. Have a great weekend. Continue to worship. Be broken and poured